Forget everything you've seen in movies about majestic and cozy medieval castles. The romantic image of stone giants where knights and ladies warm themselves by the fireplace is just a beautiful illusion. The reality was much colder, darker, and required a daily, exhausting struggle for survival. In fact, a castle was not a home, but a giant stone trap for the cold. Its walls, designed to protect against enemies, became the main source of suffering for its inhabitants during the winter months. It was a battle not for life, but for warmth, and it was fought with ingenuity, improvised tools, and centuries of refined knowledge. Watch the video to the end to find out how a medieval bed was turned into an impregnable fortress against the cold, and why the largest fireplace in the castle was almost useless for heating. What if I told you that absolutely everything you firmly believed about comfortable life in a majestic medieval castle is a romantic untruth and a misconception? In the modern world, we are accustomed to thinking of the massive stone walls of castles as a symbol of unshakable reliability, protection from enemies, and safety for its inhabitants. But in the cold winter months, these same thick protective walls paradoxically became the main invisible enemy of their own inhabitants, mercilessly turning the impregnable castle into a giant stone refrigerator with no possibility of escape. Romantic notions of a warm life in a castle were shattered by the harsh reality of medieval life, where cold was a constant companion even for the nobility. Natural stone has very high thermal conductivity and enormous heat capacity according to the laws of physics. In practice, this means that it very easily and quickly absorbs the surrounding cold from the air and then very slowly, over the course of months, releases it back. During the harsh winter, the massive, multi-meter walls of the medieval castle literally froze through to the core, gradually accumulating and retaining the icy cold that was impossible to dispel. The stone became a cold accumulator that worked against the inhabitants of the castle throughout the winter season without interruption. Even if a bright fire was constantly burning in the huge fireplaces inside the castle's vast halls, its modest heat was completely insufficient to warm the thick stone walls to a comfortable temperature. The frozen walls constantly acted as an inexhaustible source of piercing cold, continuously radiating it into all the interior rooms of the castle day and night. Being in a room next to such an icy stone wall was absolutely like standing right next to a wide-open window on a frosty, windy day outside. The cold from the walls was physically felt, penetrating through clothing and forcing people to stay closer to the fire. This destructive effect was greatly exacerbated by the enormous size of the castle's ceremonial rooms and the very high vaulted ceilings, designed for grandeur. The warm air from the few fireplaces and burning candles immediately rose, according to the laws of physics, to the cold stone vaults of the castle, where it dissipated into thin air. Below, at human height, where people were, only cold, damp, and humid air remained, from which it was impossible to escape. It turned out that all the heat went where no one could feel it, and people froze in the lower layers of air. For the average medieval person living in a castle, this meant a constant, exhausting feeling of chills and discomfort throughout the winter months. The piercing cold mercilessly penetrated the layers of clothing and furs, causing unpleasant numbness in the hands and feet, making work difficult. Life in a majestic castle in winter was not at all a pleasure of aristocratic luxury and privilege, but a real daily test of physical endurance and patience for all its inhabitants. Even wealthy lords could not buy warmth with money. The technology of the time simply did not allow such huge stone buildings to be heated effectively. In essence, and according to the original plan, medieval castles were designed by military engineers exclusively for warfare and defense against enemies, and not at all for the domestic comfort of their inhabitants. The enormous thickness of the walls, the narrow loopholes for shooting, the strategic location of rooms and corridors, absolutely everything was strictly subordinated to a single goal: the most effective defense of the fortress against siege. How people would live for months within these harsh stone walls was the last thing on the minds of medieval engineers and architects of the time, if they thought about it at all. Military functionality always came first, and the comfort of the inhabitants was a secondary consideration that could be sacrificed. Thermal insulation, as we understand it today, simply did not exist in medieval construction practices. There was no insulation in the walls, no double insulated walls, and no airtight windows with double glazing. Medieval castles were practically open to all the cold winds that blew through their corridors, and their unfortunate inhabitants simply had to adapt to these extremely harsh conditions as best they could by dressing warmer. The only protection from the cold was thick clothing, furs, and proximity to the fire, but this was clearly not enough for comfort. Therefore, paradoxically, the main enemy of the castle inhabitants' health was not the cold, frosty air outside the walls, but the castle itself from the inside with its frozen walls. Its massive stone heart remained mercilessly icy throughout the long winter, continuously sucking out the heat. The constant, exhausting struggle with this relentless internal cold was the basis of daily survival in the castle for its inhabitants. People spent the winter in a permanent state of chills, which negatively affected the health and life expectancy of even the nobility. Modern heating and insulation technologies allow us to live comfortably in constant warmth and comfort, which would have seemed like a real miracle and magic to a powerful medieval lord. In the 21st century, we rarely think seriously about how central heating works in our modern homes and apartments. It is taken for granted, a convenience that we accept as our due and natural right, without appreciating it. We simply turn the temperature control and get the desired comfort without thinking about what progress this is compared to the past. This constant, exhausting struggle against the pervasive cold fundamentally shaped the entire way of life, daily habits, and even the character and mentality of the people of that harsh era. It inevitably forced them to be inventive in their search for warmth and to sincerely appreciate every precious bit of heat as the greatest blessing. It was a completely different world in the Middle Ages, where basic warmth was the main luxury, not comfort. The ability to keep warm was valued above many other blessings, which is difficult for modern people, accustomed to central heating, to understand. It would be very interesting to hear your balanced opinion on this issue. What exactly do you think about how modern heating and construction technologies have radically changed our basic perception of comfort and standards of living compared to the harsh Middle Ages? Please write about this in detail in the comments below. Are you ready to learn the truth about the heart of any castle, the giant fireplace in the main hall? In all the paintings and movies, it is here that the inhabitants of the castle gather to enjoy the warmth and comfort. However, in reality, this fireplace was one of the most inefficient heating devices in human history. Its size was truly impressive. You could roast a whole bull in the hearth of such a fireplace, but its main function was not so much heating as demonstrating the status and wealth of the castle's owner. The problem lay in its design. The huge open portal and straight, wide chimney acted like a powerful pump. Almost all the heat generated by the fire instantly escaped up the chimney along with the smoke. The efficiency of such a fireplace was negligible. It provided heat only in the immediate vicinity of the fire. Taking a few steps to the side meant being back in the icy cold of the huge hall. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that a huge amount of air was required for the fire to burn. This air was sucked into the hall through numerous cracks in the windows and doors. As a result, the fireplace itself created icy drafts that swept through the room. Smoke was another serious problem. Due to the imperfect design of the chimneys, most of the smoke did not go up the flue, but into the hall. The rooms were constantly smoky, and a thick layer of soot settled on the walls and ceiling. A huge amount of firewood was required to keep the fire going in such a fireplace. The preparation, delivery, and storage of fuel were one of the main concerns of the castle manager. Wood was a valuable resource, and its consumption was enormous. Despite all its shortcomings, the fireplace remained the center of social life. People gathered around its fire to eat, discuss the news, and simply be together. It was the brightest and relatively warmest place in the castle. People sitting by the fire constantly turned to warm one side or the other. It was a kind of ritual familiar to every inhabitant of the castle. It was practically impossible to warm up completely. The great fireplace was a symbol, but not a solution to the problem. It provided more light and smoke than heat. The real secrets of survival in the cold were hidden not in it, but in other, less obvious things. But what if I told you that the warmest place in the castle was not where you think it is, and that its secret was hidden in the very structure of the walls? In the next chapter, we will reveal the secret of the most desirable room in the entire castle. The secret that has been passed down from generation to generation is the ability to use what you have correctly. Medieval architects, although they did not have the technology for thermal insulation, understood the laws of nature perfectly. It was this knowledge that allowed them to create a small oasis of warmth in the icy castle, a room known as the solar. It was the private living quarters of the lord and his family, a kind of medieval living room. Its name comes from the Latin word sol, meaning sun, and this name was absolutely justified. The secret of the solarium's warmth lay in its thoughtful location. This room was always built on the top floor, usually above the main hall. As we know, warm air rises, and the solarium received additional heat from the fireplace burning below. Moreover, the windows of the solar always face south, the sunniest side. On clear winter days, the sun's rays penetrated the room, heating the air and objects. It was a free and effective source of heat. The size of the room was also of great importance. Unlike the gigantic and echoing main hall, the solar was relatively small and cozy. Such a compact space was much easier to heat. The solar always had its own small fireplace. It was much more efficient than the giant hearth in the main hall. Its smaller size and more thoughtful design allowed it to give off more heat into the room rather than up the chimney. The walls of the solarium were never left bare. They were decorated with wooden panels or, even better, heavy wool tapestries. These tapestries were not just a luxury item, but an essential element of thermal insulation, blocking the cold coming from the stone. Thick carpets or skins were spread on the floor. They also helped to retain heat and protected the feet from the cold stone floor. Everything in this room was designed to create maximum comfort. It was in the solar that the Lord's family spent most of their time in winter. Here they ate, rested, and received close guests. It was their private, warm refuge from the cold and bustle of the rest of the castle. The solar is a striking example of medieval ingenuity. Unable to change the general conditions, people created local areas of comfort. They used the laws of physics and nature to reclaim at least one small space from the cold. What you never saw, but what every inhabitant of the castle felt, was the constant movement of cold air. Drafts were a real curse of medieval life. They penetrated from everywhere, nullifying all efforts to heat the rooms. The main sources of drafts were windows. In the early Middle Ages, windows as we understand them did not exist. They were simple openings in the wall, which at best were covered with wooden shutters or oiled parchment. Glass was an incredibly expensive and rare material. Only the richest castles could afford small glass inserts set in lead frames. But even these windows were not airtight. Loopholes and embrasures, designed for shooting, were also constant sources of icy air. It was impossible to close them tightly. In winter, the cold blew through them so strongly that it was easy to extinguish a candle. Doors were another problem. They were made of solid planks that dried out and warped over time. There were always huge gaps between the door and the frame. Even the keyholes contributed to the overall picture. Thin but icy streams of air penetrated the rooms through them. Every little thing mattered in this total war against the cold. One of the most unexpected sources of cold was the wardrobe, a medieval toilet. It was a simple stone seat located in a niche in the wall with an opening leading outside. A stream of icy air constantly flowed into the castle through this shaft. The fight against drafts was carried out using primitive but effective methods. Cracks in windows and doors were plugged with moss, tow, or simply old rags. It was a constant job that had to be done over and over again. Heavy curtains made of thick fabric or animal skins were hung on the doors. They created an additional barrier to the cold air. Sometimes several layers of such curtains were used. Special screens were placed in front of fireplaces. They protected those sitting by the fire from the icy drafts that crept across the floor toward the hearth. It was a simple but effective solution. The constant movement of air made staying in the castle extremely uncomfortable. People were forced to constantly look for places protected from drafts. How much do you think such living conditions affected people's health and well-being? In the next chapter, you will learn how medieval inhabitants turned their beds into real fortresses against the cold. When night fell on the castle and the last embers in the fireplace began to die out, the only refuge from the pervasive cold was the bed. But it was not just a bed in the modern sense. It was a complex, multifunctional structure, a veritable fortress within a fortress. The most important element was its structure. The bed of a nobleman was huge with 4 tall posts at the corners. A wooden frame, or canopy, was attached to these posts. Heavy, thick curtains hung from this frame on all 4 sides. They were made of velvet, wool, or other thick fabric, often lined with fur. At night, these curtains were drawn tightly, creating a small enclosed space. In this way, the bed was transformed into a small room within a room. Inside this fabric cocoon, the air remained still. This protected sleepers from the icy drafts that swept through the bedroom. Mattresses or feather beds also played an important role. They were not stuffed with cotton wool or springs, but with natural materials. Poor people slept on straw mattresses, while rich people slept on feather beds stuffed with goose down and feathers. Down and feathers are excellent insulators. They created a soft and warm bed that provided additional protection from the cold. Such a feather bed could be up to half a meter thick. People covered themselves with several layers of blankets and bedspreads. These were made of wool, the best material for retaining heat. The most valuable item was a fur bedspread, which was not only warm but also demonstrated the high status of its owner. Special warmers were used for additional warmth. These were metal or ceramic vessels in which hot coals from the fireplace were placed. Such a warmer, wrapped in cloth, was placed in bed before going to sleep to warm the sheets. Often, several people slept in one bed. This was done not only because of the lack of space, but also for warmth. The bodies of the sleepers warmed each other, making it easier to endure the night cold. Thus, the medieval bed was not just a piece of furniture, but a well-thought-out survival system. It allowed people to survive the long, cold nights in a frozen stone castle. It was the only truly warm and safe place. What if I showed you a real time machine that would instantly transport us to the wardrobe of a typical medieval resident of any social class? We would definitely not see the light, comfortable, and beautiful items we are used to today. Clothing in the harsh Middle Ages was not so much a fashion accessory or a means of self-expression as it was the first and foremost vital line of defense against the pervasive cold and inclement weather. Each item of clothing had a strictly functional purpose and was necessary for survival in cold castles and unheated homes. The fundamental principle of medieval clothing was a well-thought-out layering system that created air insulation. No one in their right mind would wear a single thick, warm garment in the hope of keeping warm that way. People methodically dressed in layers like cabbage, deliberately creating air pockets between the numerous layers of clothing, which perfectly retained the precious heat of the human body and did not let it escape. The more layers there were, the warmer a person was, as each layer of air acted as an additional insulator from the cold outside environment. The bottom layer, closest to the body, was a long shirt or camisole in medieval language, neatly sewn from natural linen fabric produced at home. Linen was a relatively hygienic natural material that absorbed body sweat well and allowed the skin to breathe, preventing irritation. However, thin linen itself did not keep a person warm at all. Its main practical purpose was to protect more expensive outer clothing from direct contamination with sweat and skin oils. Linen shirts were washed more often than outer clothing, which was important for hygiene in conditions of limited access to water. Over the basic shirt, men always wore long, tight-fitting hose tied to the belt and a loose knee-length tunic, while women wore a long, floor-length dress with sleeves that concealed the figure. Absolutely all of these everyday items were sewn mainly from durable woolen fabric of various thicknesses and qualities. Wool was the main, indispensable material for clothing throughout the Middle Ages, and there were very good practical reasons for this, proven over centuries. Without wool, it was almost impossible to survive in the medieval climate, especially in the northern regions of Europe. Wool fabric has a unique property. Even when completely wet from rain, it continues to effectively retain body heat, unlike other materials. Its natural fibers have a special hollow porous structure that perfectly traps air inside, creating insulation. In addition, high-quality wool is very wear-resistant and durable, which was critically important in harsh conditions when new clothes were very expensive and inaccessible to ordinary people. One woolen tunic could serve its owner for many years, being passed down to children after the death of their parents. During the cold winter months, an additional thick layer was always worn over the basic tunic or dress, a surcoat or upland, depending on the region and era. This was a loose-fitting, unfastened outer garment, often with long, wide sleeves for freedom of movement. It was also traditionally made of thick, dense wool, sometimes felted for extra protection from the wind. This outer layer protected against wind and rain, preventing the cold from penetrating the body through the lower layers of clothing. The warmest, most luxurious, and most expensive element of the medieval wardrobe was special clothing, generously lined on the inside or richly trimmed on the outside with natural fur from fur-bearing animals. Natural fur was not only an incredibly warm and practical material for harsh winters, but also served as an important indicator of the social status and wealth of the owner. Kings and the highest aristocracy wore rare white ermine and precious sable brought from afar, while simpler and poorer people had to make do with affordable squirrel, cheap rabbit, or coarse sheepskin. The quality and quantity of fur directly indicated a person's position in society. It was absolutely necessary to wear a linen cap or woolen hood covering the ears from the cold. A significant amount of heat, up to 40%, is irretrievably lost through an uncovered head, and medieval people understood this perfectly well empirically, without scientific knowledge. In the cold rooms of the castle, headgear was almost never removed, even during meals, except in the presence of the highest nobility or in church. Walking with an uncovered head in winter was considered reckless and a sure way to get sick. Proper footwear was also critical for keeping feet warm and healthy. Tall leather boots were tightly stuffed with dry straw or wool scraps on the inside to provide extra warmth and cushioning. Indoors, special wooden clogs with platforms could be worn over them to further protect the feet from the cold stone and dirty floors, which were always icy. This double protection for the feet was necessary to prevent frostbite and rheumatism in conditions of constant cold. Thus, a typical medieval person of any social class constantly wore several heavy kilograms of layered clothing every day from morning to night. This was not very convenient for movement and work, as it restricted movement, but it was absolutely essential for survival in the cold. How physically comfortable do you think a pampered modern person would be in such heavy medieval clothing all day long? Most likely we would quickly tire of the weight of the clothing and the restriction of movement, but there was simply no alternative. But how did the many people who did not have privileged access to personal fireplaces in their chambers and expensive imported furs for clothing keep warm? In the next fascinating chapter, we will talk in detail about the various mobile portable heat sources that medieval people carried with them. Not every room in a castle had a fireplace. Building them was a complex and expensive undertaking. Portable devices called braziers were used to heat rooms that did not have fixed fireplaces. A brazier was a metal or ceramic bowl on legs. Hot coals were placed inside this bowl. The brazier radiated heat and could be moved from room to room as needed. It was a simple and effective solution for local heating. Braziers were placed in the center of the room, and people gathered around them to warm themselves. They were often used in guard barracks, workshops, or servants' dining rooms. The fuel for the braziers was not ordinary charcoal, but wood that had undergone special treatment. The wood was first burned in pits with limited oxygen access. The result was pure carbon, which burned with almost no smoke. It was impossible to use ordinary wood in a brazier indoors. It produced a huge amount of smoke, which would quickly fill the room. Charcoal solved this problem. However, braziers had one huge and deadly drawback. When charcoal burned in conditions of oxygen deficiency, carbon monoxide was released. This gas is colorless and odorless, but it is a deadly poison. History knows of numerous cases when people fell asleep in a room with a smoldering brazier and never woke up. Ventilation in castles was far from ideal. Therefore, the use of braziers required great caution. Despite the danger, braziers were an integral part of medieval life. They were the only way to bring heat to places where there was no fireplace. It was a compromise between comfort and risk. Their design could be either very simple or very sophisticated. Braziers for the nobility were made of bronze or silver and decorated with embossing, but the principle of their operation remained the same. Thus, the brazier was the mobile heart of the castle. It provided warmth, but in return required constant attention and caution. This is another example of how survival in the Middle Ages was a balancing act. In the icy damp realm of the medieval castle, where cold was a constant companion of the inhabitants, there was one unique place where heat, steam, and bustle reigned supreme all year round. This special place was the vast castle kitchen, with its constantly burning hearths, usually located in a separate building in the courtyard or in the spacious basement of the main tower for safety reasons. It was a veritable production facility for mass cooking for dozens or even hundreds of mouths. The kitchen operated like a complex mechanism where everyone knew their role and performed it from morning to night without interruption. The heart of any castle kitchen was a huge, massive stone hearth, which with its impressive size could easily rival the ceremonial fireplace in the main hall for guests, and sometimes even surpassed it. But unlike the decorative fireplace, which was only lit periodically, this working hearth operated almost around the clock, without stopping, day or night. Something was always cooking in pots, roasting on spits, and baking in ovens, creating incredible heat. The fire in the kitchen was a living thing that needed constant attention and feeding with wood, and it only went out late at night for a few hours. Huge, soot-covered iron cauldrons with a capacity of tens of liters hung on thick chains above the roaring fire, in which thick soups, rich broths, and stewed meat for the servants were cooked for a long time. Whole carcasses of animals, wild boars, deer, and sheep, were methodically roasted on long metal spits, which were slowly rotated by special complex mechanisms with counterweights or by small cooks manually for hours for the master's table. Next to the main hearth were special stone ovens for daily baking of bread and pies, which also constantly radiated a huge amount of additional heat into the room. The temperature in the kitchen could reach unbearable levels, even in the middle of winter. Daily work in such a hot kitchen was incredibly hard and exhausting physical labor, requiring endurance and skill. The cooks and their numerous assistants were constantly on the move, performing dozens of tasks at once: chopping meat, cleaning vegetables, stirring cauldrons. The unbearable heat from the raging fire was so intense and suffocating that even in the depths of winter, the exhausted workers had to labor in light, minimal clothing, rolling up their sleeves. Sweat poured off them in streams, and they had to drink water constantly to avoid fainting from overheating and dehydration in this inferno. The kitchen was not only a utilitarian place for cooking for the castle, but also an important secondary source of precious heat for the entire cold building. Much of this excess heat naturally spread through the narrow corridors and adjacent rooms through doors and cracks, warming them slightly. Frozen servants and soldiers often deliberately sought any excuse or reason to enter the warm kitchen under the pretext of business and at least warm themselves a little by the fire, warming their numb hands. The kitchen was a magnet for all the freezing inhabitants of the castle seeking refuge from the cold. Here in the kitchen, there was always an abundance of hot, even boiling water in the boilers, which was a great rarity and luxury for the rest of the castle. Water was constantly heated in large boilers for washing mountains of dirty dishes and for various household needs related to cooking. The opportunity to wash your hands and face in warm, pleasant water, rather than in ice-cold water from the well, was a real luxury for ordinary servants. Many came to the kitchen specifically to take advantage of this blessing of civilization and feel a little more comfortable. It was in the hot kitchen, with its constant warmth, that clothes and shoes wet from rain or snow could be dried quickly and effectively. Chilled servants and soldiers on patrol regularly brought their wet, heavy cloaks and soaked leather boots here, hanging them by the fire. The rich air in the room was thick with the mixed smells of food being prepared, acrid smoke from the hearth, and drying wet fabric, creating a unique atmosphere. This specific smell of the kitchen was recognizable from afar and was associated with warmth and satiety. The kitchen was a separate, closed world with its own strict rules, traditions, and clear hierarchy of authority. At the head of this small kingdom stood an experienced chef, often a foreigner, who was personally responsible for all cooking processes and the quality of the dishes. His professional authority was absolutely unquestionable for all employees, because it was his skill and organization that determined whether the entire castle and all its inhabitants would be fed on time and with high quality. The Lord's dissatisfaction with the food could cost the chef his position, so he ruled the kitchen with an iron fist, demanding perfection. The strategic location of the kitchen within the castle structure was very often dictated by serious fire safety considerations for the entire building. The huge open fire of the hearth, burning constantly, posed a serious potential threat to the wooden structures of the castle, beams, floors, and furniture. Therefore, prudent builders tried to construct the kitchen at a considerable distance from the Lord's living quarters in important rooms, often in a separate building. In the event of a fire in the kitchen, which happened quite often, the fire was not supposed to spread to the main buildings and destroy the entire castle. Despite the objectively difficult and exhausting working conditions in the heat and stuffiness, the kitchen was, paradoxically, the warmest, coziest, and perhaps the most lively and noisy place in the entire cold castle. It was the real driving force and heart of the castle, which not only fed all its inhabitants 3 times a day, but also, in the most literal physical sense, warmed them with its excess heat. Life here was bustling, bubbling, and never quiet at any time of the year or day, whether summer or winter, day or night. Heat in a medieval castle depended directly on one simple resource: firewood. But what seems simple to us today was a complex logistical task in those days. Providing the castle with fuel for the winter was a matter of strategic importance. The castle's need for firewood was enormous. Just one large fireplace in the main hall could burn several cubic meters of wood a day. And there were also fireplaces in other rooms, a hearth in the kitchen, and a forge in the smithy. The right to cut down trees was strictly regulated. The forest belonged to the feudal lord, and the peasants could only collect deadwood there. Firewood for the castle was harvested centrally by special workers. The harvesting process was long and laborious. Trees were felled with axes and saws. Then the trunks were cut into logs. All this was done by hand and required enormous physical effort, but simply cutting down a tree was not enough. Freshly cut wood burns poorly, producing a lot of smoke and little heat. The wood had to be left to rest and dry, which took from several months to a year. Special wood piles were built for drying and storing firewood. These were large sheds that protected the wood from rain, but were well ventilated. The winter supply of firewood took up a huge amount of space on the castle grounds. Delivering firewood from the forest to the castle was also a difficult task. It was transported on carts pulled by oxen or horses. In winter, when the roads were covered with snow, fuel delivery could come to a complete halt. Therefore, one of the main tasks of the manager was to create a sufficient supply of firewood before the onset of cold weather. A shortage of fuel in winter could have catastrophic consequences. It was equivalent to a modern army running out of ammunition. Different types of wood were valued differently. Oak and beech produced a lot of heat and burned for a long time. Conifers burned quickly and sparked a lot, so they were used less often. Thus, behind every log burning in the fireplace was the hard work of many people. Heat in the castle did not appear at the snap of a finger. It was the result of complex and well-organized work. Cold in a medieval castle was universal, but it was distributed extremely unevenly. How a person experienced winter depended directly on their place in the social hierarchy. There was an icy chasm between the life of a lord and that of a simple guard. The lord's family lived in the most protected and warmest part of the castle. They had a solar with its own fireplace, sunny side, and tapestries on the walls. They slept in huge four-poster beds, covered with fur blankets. Their clothes were made of the finest wool and lined with expensive furs. They ate hot food brought to them directly from the kitchen. Their life was as comfortable as possible under the circumstances. The situation was completely different for the servants and soldiers. They lived in communal barracks or slept directly on the floor in large halls. Their bed was often a simple straw mattress thrown on the stone floor. They covered themselves with rough woolen blankets, if they had any at all. Often, the only way to keep warm was to huddle close together. There was virtually no personal space. Their clothes were made of coarse, cheap wool. They wore them for years until they were in tatters. Fur lining was out of the question. They spent most of the day on their feet doing hard physical labor. This helped them stay warm, but it also took a lot of energy. The guards on the walls stood for hours in the biting wind, risking frostbite. The only warm places for them were the kitchen and the common room when the large fireplace was lit. But even there, they were assigned seats far from the fire, in the area of icy drafts. The right to sit by the hearth belonged to the nobility. Illnesses caused by constant hypothermia were common among the lower classes of the castle. Only the strongest and most resilient survived. Natural selection in action. In this way, the castle was a microcosm of medieval society as a whole. Even such a basic need as warmth was a privilege, not a right. The cold emphasized and reinforced social inequality, making it physically palpable. We have taken a journey into the cold heart of a medieval castle. Now we know that behind the majestic facades lay a daily struggle for survival. It was a world where warmth was worth its weight in gold, and simple things like dry clothes or the absence of drafts were a real luxury. The ingenuity of medieval man in this struggle is astonishing. From layered clothing and fortress beds to the thoughtful layout of rooms and the use of tapestries, people found ways to survive and create islands of comfort in the harshest conditions. This story teaches us to appreciate the incredible level of comfort we have today. Central heating, hot water, sealed windows. These are all wonders that the inhabitants of castles could not even dream of. They remind us of how far humanity has come in its quest for warmth and comfort. Please suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. Perhaps you are interested in medieval medicine, cathedral construction, or the daily life of townspeople? Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our new historical investigations.
Rising over decades.